My name is Ibukun, and I'm going to be talking about the Oso Mudslide that occurred in Washington in 2014. So it occurred on March 22nd, 2014 in Oso, Washington state, and resulted in 43 deaths, 10 injuries, and 40 homes that were completely consumed, including the entire community of Steelhead Haven. It occurred as a result of increased rainfall in the preceding months. They estimated that 150 to 200% more precipitation than previous years on average. It also occurred as a result of landslides that had occurred in that area previously and slope erosion as a result of those landslides. It involved the North Fork Stillaguamish River as well as Highway 530, completely destroying the latter to where it needed to be rebuilt following the disaster. Here I have a picture of the area and the direction of the mudslide, including the region that it involved, involving the river as well as blocking it, and then also involving the Highway 530. Excuse me. Key players in this event were the community inhabitants who were victims and also served as rescue personnel to clean up debris and to help extract those that were trapped by the debris. There was also a timber company that was involved with logging wood, and by doing so disturbed the environment and made it more susceptible to landslides. Some agencies that were involved were the U.S. Geological Survey that looked into the area following the disaster to see which regions were more prone for the landslides. FEMA that was activated by President Obama to help coordinate a response in this disaster, as well as the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that involved in rebuilding the highway following cleanup. The Washington State Department of Natural Resources provided the resources as far as food and clothing and shelter to individuals that were impacted by this disaster. And then the Stillaguamish Tribe of Indians provided volunteers to survivors from this disaster. In addition, some non-governmental organizations were involved in humanitarian efforts, including World Vision and Red Cross, that provided cleanup, comfort, and hygiene kits to survivors. They also provided food and resources to where victims could rebuild their homes following this disaster. They provided transportation, emotional support, and some basic health needs to these survivors that oftentimes are left without nothing, or with nothing, excuse me. The public health response on a local level included volunteers from the Snohomish County, including the Stillaguamish Tribe of Indians, and they worked in an emergency call center to provide assistance wherever needed to victims and their families. The health district also provided H95 masks that were left over from the 2009 influenza epidemic so that survivors were not overburdened by the debris. On the state level, the Washington National Guard did send a search and extraction team, as well as helicopters, to assist with finding those who were deceased or who were trapped in debris. The state provided resources as far as food and money, and also crisis counseling for individuals who had lost loved ones. Law enforcement was helpful in providing safety and direction to where victims could go, and also medical examiners who provided medical evaluation for those that were injured or affected by this disaster. And transportation, as many individuals had lost their source of transportation, and the highway was destroyed from this disaster. On a federal level, was FEMA. So President Obama had he signed a declaration of emergency um, and thereby activated FEMA to coordinate response to this disaster. The Department of Natural Resources provided food, provided shelter, provided counseling and water and transportation to these individuals that were affected in this community. The Federal Highway Administration did provide $1 million to help rebuild the highway and to help clean up debris from the Highway 530 that was destroyed. And finally, the U.S. Geological Survey looked into what caused this disaster, and they set up these spiders, which were monitoring device units that would monitor the area for little pockets that were more susceptible to landslide, especially as the rescue personnel were working in that area to protect those working and to prevent future landslides that might occur as a result of this big one. The community was resilient to the disaster. So with assistance from the state and federal governments, they were able to rebuild the Highway 530 6 months later, and they built it at a higher elevation, and this was with assistance from the U.S. Corps of Engineers. In addition, there was a community chapel in Oso that welcomed victims and their families and really fostered a sense of community engagement so that they could essentially build their community and provided a place of comfort, provided a place of shelter and fellowship for the community so that they could rebuild after this disaster. And finally, the food bank in Darrington, the city of Darrington, reached out and provided food for many community members. Prior to this disaster, they were feeding 500 people a day. This increased to 1,800 people a day. And this was significant because the city only had about 1,300 people in it. And so they were feeding more than was expected and really providing to a spectrum of victims and their families that were impacted by this disaster. As a result of this disaster, the state of Washington implemented new rules about logging in areas that were prone to landslides, such as Oso, and the U.S. Geological Survey collaborated with community partners to develop this presentation called Gravity Never Sleeps that brought around a heightened sense of awareness of areas that were prone to landslides and natural disasters, specifically with landslides, to make these cities that have these areas more astute to their living conditions and their rivers and their slopes to prevent such a disaster as occurred in Oso. The humanitarian efforts continued to restore victims back to what would be closest to their previous normal, and to reunite families with their loved ones that had died as a result of this event so that they could have closure. And finally, there was a $60 million settlement between survivors, victims and their families, and the state of Washington, as well as this logging company that had disturbed the land, to compensate victims and their families for the disaster that they had undergone. These are my references. Thank you so much for watching my presentation.